Let's welcome Patrick Battuello of the Albany-based group Horseracing Wrongs. We should note, we asked the Jockey Club to join us, but they were unable to provide us with a guest. So I want to go, you just said deaths are inevitable. Why?
Well, first, it's the way they're bred. They're bred for speed, so they have big torsos, spindly legs, fragile ankles. They're being raced on unformed bodies, so the typical horse does not fully mature until 6. The typical racehorse is thrust into an intensive training regimen at 18 months and raced at 2, which is the rough equivalent of a first grader. There is an incessant grinding of those unformed bodies because if they're not racing, they're not earning. They're being asked to do something that is unnatural, to run at a breakneck speed with perched whip-wielding jockeys atop. And of course, they are commodified. So the typical racehorse will change hands several times over the course of his so-called career. And of course, that speaks to the constant anxiety and stress that these animals are forced to endure.
Well, Patrick, take off the table eliminating horse racing. I want to ask you really viably, what solves this then?
What solves this? Well, from our perspective, this has to end. I'm a big fan of ESPN and this show in particular, but I would take issue with this being a topic, for ESPN, because in fact, horse racing resembles no other accepted sport on the planet. And what other sport are the bodies of adolescent athletes pounded into the ground? And what other sport are the athletes kept locked in tiny 12 by 12 rooms alone for over 23 hours a day? And what other sport are the athletes condemned to a life as literal chattel? And what other sport are the athletes drugged and doped without consent? And what other sport are the athletes whipped, beaten for motivation? And what other sport are the athletes routinely dying on the playing field? And in what other sport are the athletes brutally bled out and butchered when their so-called careers have come to an end?
Well, but I would argue then, obviously, these horses, the race horses, are bred for this very purpose. I mean, with the elimination of horse racing sounds like a very easy solution to a complicated problem. It's not as simple as somebody coming in and saying this is no longer going to be a sport, right?
Right. Well, again, I'm looking to Americans to reassess this industry in its entirety. We have been sold this as a sport since birth. We are conditioned to think of it that way. ESPN itself named Secretariat the 35th greatest athlete of the 20th century. In fact, it's no different than Ringling Brothers or SeaWorld, or certainly no different than greyhound racing, all of which Americans have or are currently in the process of rejecting outright as immoral. So why should horse racing be given cover under the banner of sport?
Quickly, before we let you go, if there was one entity that could force any sort of actual change that could be instituted quickly to horse racing, is there one area that could look to make that change?
I don't believe so, Jason. If you look at this, again, the Horse Racing Integrity Act, which is bandied about by the reformers, is a ruse. It clearly suggests that all this stands in front of ethical horse racing is a rampant drug culture. And while drugs do play a part and are certainly a wrong, it's just one of many, starting with the things that we've already talked about. And just so your listeners know, horse racing kills over 2,000 horses a year, just racing and training. Hundreds more are dying back in their stalls.
Patrick, I appreciate the information and the time very much. Unfortunately, we are up against the clock. We've got to let you go. Thank you so much for joining us and for the great information.